Hey there. My favorite line in the Zhuang Lun, which is an old Taoist text outlining the Taoist meditation practice of Zhuang, which means sit, forget, usually translated as sitting and forgetting, or even sitting in oblivion, states, "Faith is the root of Tao. Respect is the stem of inherent potency. When the root is deep, Tao can grow tall. When its stem is strong, potency can flourish." Now there's a lot of meaning and symbolism packed into this verse, but what we're going to talk about today is the very beginning of it, specifically faith being the root of Tao, and some differences between faith and trust. Faith and trust are most often used interchangeably in our common language and discourse, but they're not exactly synonymous. Trust has more an experiential quality than does faith. So we could think of it as faith plus experience equals trust. Faith has a bit more of an implied hoping, whereas trust has a bit more of an implied knowing. It's a little more solid in that way. And you'll see various sayings and such in Taoism, taking refuge in the Tao, for example. The idea of taking refuge implies trust. Because if you didn't trust that you would be sheltered, then you wouldn't be taking refuge so confidently. And here we have, for example, this is called the 9 Beams, 9 Folds hat or scarf. It's a hat traditionally worn by Zheng Yi school Taoists and symbolizes the angled or slanted rooftop along with the 9 beams of old school Chinese architecture that was used for roofs and buildings. And when you wear this, you're basically stating you're taking refuge in the Tao to be sheltered from the various storms and calamities of life and the world, just like you would take refuge for shelter under a sturdy roof from the elements. Okay? Now, if we're talking about trust, why is faith important? Well, faith is the root of Tao, and that's because in the beginning, that's all you have. When you're starting a Taoist practice or any other sort of spiritual, religious, philosophical practice, or really anything in life with which you have no previous experience, you don't have an efficacious foundation of your own on which to build and to determine the reality and truth or untruth of any of these teachings and practices. So you take on faith that what is said in the ancient texts is true and real, that what your teachers are teaching you is true and real. And if you have sincerity and discipline and you practice with that sincerity and discipline, then eventually your results will be similar to those who have come before you. For whatever reasons you start this stuff in the first place, your reasons are your own, but you've not yet experienced them for yourself, so you take that on faith. But over time, being that faith is the root of Tao, with sufficient cultivation and nourishing of that root, it can grow and bloom into trust. Trust is one of these things in Taoism that maybe isn't directly addressed all that much, but is always present and prevalent in everything. There's always this sort of inherent trust going on, trusting in the Tao, which means, at some point, trust in yourself. You don't have to micromanage the world. In fact, I'd recommend not trying to micromanage the world. But you are the mechanism and the conduit through which that trust manifests in the world. Trust in the Tao eventually means more trust in yourself, greater self-confidence, and just that trust that even if you don't know how things are going to go, you don't really need to know because you have that trust and you have taken refuge. Traditionally, Taoists have been fishermen and farmers, both vocations which require a great degree of trust. Even if there's a dry spell or a drought, you trust that if you've properly cultivated the land and planted your crop, the rains will eventually come and they will bear fruit. Even if the fish ain't biting, if you've properly baited and cast your lines, eventually the fish will come. Begging, incidentally, is also a display of trust. This is most often associated with the Buddhist tradition, although there was some of it in the early Chanzhen, or complete reality school of Taoism, mostly from the Buddhist influence, and it's debatable as to how much of that actually went on. But begging back then in those days had a much, much, much different meaning than it does in our modern world. It was a display of trust that you would be provided for, you'd be taken care of. Taoists are not helpless, Taoists are not powerless, Taoists do not beg. It was not a begging like, oh, I'm helpless, take mercy on me. No, it was actually a show of strength and more of the internal trust that you would be provided for. So Taoists don't do those things, but what Taoists do is practice trust and seek to demonstrate that throughout life. Every moment of every day, you have the opportunity to choose to trust, which is more experiential, or to live in fear and do whatever else it is that you might do and see where that gets you. I mean, either way, you can't predict the outcomes. It's up to you. The more you do it and try it for yourself, and don't just take things on faith, a little wordplay, the more you will develop that trust, the more assured you will be in it, and the more you'll trust yourself, trust your decisions, and trust that life can work for you rather than being out to get you and work against you. Okay? Thank you for paying attention to this. I hope you did, and I hope you learned something useful. Until next time, Dao Wen.